Welcome to the Texas Historical Commission webinar, Texas in World War II. September 2nd, 2020 marked the 75th anniversary of Imperial Japan's surrender and the end of the Second World War. Today, we take a look at how a group of leaders with ties to Texas helped influence that successful conclusion. My name is Stephen Cure, and I am the Military Sites Program Coordinator for the Commission. The Military Sites Program is responsible for providing historical support to Texas military sites, managing ongoing projects for the Military History Program, and conducting special projects to increase the documentation and interpretation of the state's military history. Texas has a proud military history and military heritage based heavily on its willingness of its citizens to serve when needed. If I could have the next slide, please. Such a spirit was exemplified on May 30th, 1942, when 1,000 Houstonians were inducted to replace the crew of the USS Houston, shown here on the screen, which was lost in the Battle of Sunda Strait in March of 1942. That same willingness to serve is also demonstrated by the leaders we examine today: Admiral Nimitz, General Eisenhower, Colonel Hobby, and Speaker Rayburn. We have three very knowledgeable speakers today. First, General Michael Hagee, a native of Fredericksburg, who following graduation from the Naval Academy, rose through the ranks of the Marine Corps to be its 33rd Commandant, and now serves as President and CEO of the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg. Next, we have John Akers, who is a historian with 25 years of experience in museum management and now serves as site manager at the Eisenhower Birthplace State Historic Site in Denison and the Sam Rayburn House State Historic Site in Bonham. Last but not least, we have Stacy Flood, who is an archaeologist with 22 years of experience in the museum field and currently serves as assistant site manager at the Sam Rayburn House State Historic Site in Bonham and Eisenhower Birthplace State Historic Site in Denison. Before we begin, a few logistics. If you have questions, please place them in the Q&A area, and we will address as many as we can toward the end of the program. Also, if you need to step away for some reason, we will be distributing a recording of the program to registrants not long after it concludes. Logistics behind us, let's go ahead and dive into our program. We'll begin with General Hagee. General Hagee, if you could, how did Admiral Nimitz contribute to the overall success of the war effort?
Could I have the first slide, please? The next slide. I'd like to go back just a bit. Admiral Nimitz was born here in Fredericksburg, Texas on the 24th of February, 1885. And his father, he never knew his father. His father passed away before he was born, and so his grandfather was his father figure. And his grandfather had been a German merchant mariner before coming to the United States. And he told Admiral Nimitz, if you look at the slide, is that a young boy there standing under the word Nimitz. And he spent the first 5 or 6 years of his life in the Nimitz Hotel. At any rate, his grandfather told him that the sea, like life itself, is a stern taskmaster. And the best way to get along with either is to, number one, learn all you can, then do your best wherever you're assigned, and number three, don't worry about those things over which you have no control. He did go to the Naval Academy. There's a great story there, but we don't have time for that. And he had an atypical career. He was put in positions that very few other naval officers were, but he always did the best that he could, and he learned everything that he could, and he did not worry about things that he could not control. Next slide, please. So with the bombing of Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, he had been recognized by President Roosevelt as one of the outstanding outstanding admirals, and was directed to go to Pearl Harbor. You see here his change of command at Pearl Harbor there in the middle of just before Christmas at Pearl Harbor. And I want to set the scene for what he walked into. Obviously, Pearl Harbor had been devastated. We believe today that the outcome was a foregone conclusion. They didn't believe that at that time. Number two, the staff was completely demoralized. Number three, he knew that the CNO nor the other admirals in the Navy thought he should be there. In fact, the Secretary of War had asked the CNO, give me your top 40 admirals because I may want to move them around during the war, and Admiral Nimitz did not make the top 40 cut. He was under significant pressure there. Coral Sea, the Battle of Coral Sea followed in April of 42. Midway followed in June of 42, a tremendous success, which we may talk a little bit about in the Q&A, followed by Guadalcanal. And after Guadalcanal, he had his feet on the ground and he was in charge. He worked very well with MacArthur, which in and of itself was quite a task. Obviously, the last Battle of Okinawa occurred between April and June of 1945. The war was already over in Europe, but the servicemen were flowing from Europe to the Pacific to prepare for the invasion of Japan on the 1st of November. Of course, that did not occur because of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 6th and 9th of August, respectively. Next slide. I really like this artifact here. This shows the main deck of the USS Missouri where the surrender documents were signed. The handwriting you see on there is actually Admiral Nimitz's handwriting. Even though he was famous for delegating down to his subordinates, he could step in when things were very important and take specific action. And his writing there is assigning places for everyone for the surrender, the signing of the surrender documents on the 2nd of September. Next slide. And there he is signing the surrender documents for the United States. Interesting point here, General MacArthur was supposed to sign for both the Allied powers and the United States. When Nimitz heard about this, he became quite upset. He got hold of Truman and said that we should not do that because that does not support what the sailors and the Marines did during the war. Truman agreed with him and changed it so that Nimitz signed for the United States. From the beginning of the war to the end, in my opinion, we were quite lucky to have this great Texan in charge.
All right, Mr. Akers, would you describe the contributions of General Eisenhower to the success of the overall war effort?
Certainly. Next slide, please. So this is Dwight D. Eisenhower, who served as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II. And here's a view of him as a five-star general, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army in April of 1946 in his birthplace of Denison, Texas. He was born there in 1890 to a railroad family in what was a railroad town, spent just about the first 2 years of his life there, and that experience influenced him. But during World War II, he was, as I said, he was in charge of the American, indeed the Allied war effort in Europe. Next slide, please. So he was responsible for Operation Overlord, which was the invasion of Europe. Europe, of course, was captured by Nazi Germany in 1940. The first of many, what seemed like the unstoppable power of Nazi Germany. And there was a lot of pressure to get a second front into Europe, both to liberate it and to also assist the Soviet Union, who was fighting Nazi Germany on the other front. And this invasion was the largest seaborne invasion in world history. The first day involved over 5,000 ships, including the battleship Texas, included over thousands of aircraft, and 160,000 soldiers were delivered to the beaches on Normandy on that first day. So an immense undertaking that led to the end of the war in Europe by May of 1945. And General Hagee talked about foregone conclusions. It was not a foregone conclusion that this invasion would be successful as well. As early as 1942, American leadership wanted to have this second front into Europe, but we were not ready yet. And indeed, General Eisenhower was at the center of this. His career since 1915, when he entered his first military post in Texas, to his whole military career, prepared him and prepared the American Army for this moment. There was a series of campaigns during World War II, which prepared everyone. Operation Torch in late 1942 was the invasion of Northern Africa, which gave American and Allied troops very valuable experience in combat facing the German army. It gave the commanders, primarily General Eisenhower, experience working with the Allies and commanding in those kinds of situations. It gave them experience with amphibious operations. So of course that was D-Day, landing these troops on the beaches of Normandy. So it trained him and others in the enormous tasks that it would take. He was then appointed Supreme Commander in 1943 to coordinate this massive invasion, and just the logistics of trying to get the equipment, the landing craft, to be able to choose the landing sites, to be able to deceive the Germans about where this invasion would take place, to give the troops time to secure that foothold, to keep all the decision makers, presidents and prime ministers and various leaders all on the same page to get through that. And Eisenhower was in the center of it all, using a variety of skills that he developed over his career to keep everyone on track. And ultimately, it was his decision to launch that invasion. And again, it was successful by May of 1945. One other thing I want to say about him, to his contribution to the war effort, in April 1945, American troops liberated the first concentration camps that came under American control. And General Eisenhower, understandably, was very incensed by this, and he personally visited that concentration camp. And indeed, he ordered the Allied leadership and troops all to visit. And he said, "I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things." So he ordered that these camps and these atrocities were documented, so those responsible would be brought to justice following the war. So his contributions was really the effort that ended the war in Europe and to set the stage for the reckoning that followed after the war.
Next slide, please.
Thank you, Mr. Akers. General Hagee, if you could speak to the contributions of Colonel Hobby, please.
Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry.
One more slide.
And she was, yes, and she was as tough as she looks right there in that slide. Oveta Cult was born in Killeen, Texas, in January 1905. Incidentally, the same year that Admiral Nimitz graduated from the Naval Academy. There was an incident when she was 5 years old that I think speaks to her character. she was asked by her teacher to sign a temperance pledge in class, and she refused. And the teacher told her, if you don't sign that, I'm going to tell your mother. And she went back to her desk and sat down. When she got home, her grandmother was taking care of her, and her grandmother already knew, and so she took a switch to her. And Oveta was crying, and she finally asked her, why didn't you sign? And she said, I didn't sign because I did not understand the word. Several years later, she expanded on that, and she said, yeah, I didn't understand the word, but I knew that I wasn't doing it at that time, but I may like to do it later on, and I knew if I signed that pledge, I could not. Her younger sister asked her mother many years later what Oveta was like when she was a child, and her mother said, Oveta was never young. Because of her father, from a young age, she was always involved in politics and various causes. And then after marrying former Governor Hobby, she learned the running of a newspaper there in Houston and a radio station. She was convinced against her wishes to go to Washington and help in June of 1941 to get a bill passed in the House of Representatives that would establish a woman's auxiliary corps, which was abbreviated WAAC, which would become, would serve with the United States Army. She was actually the only woman in the Department of Defense working on that bill, and she single-handedly developed an organization on how women might serve. She worked tirelessly on the organization, the type of jobs, barracks, well-being, pretty much like Eisenhower did in the landing. She developed how women would serve in the auxiliary corps. In May of '42, the bill was approved. She actually wanted to go back to Houston, and General Marshall said, okay, bring me 8 to 9 women who might do this job of director. And when she brought the list to him, he said, I want you. And both General Marshall and her husband convinced her that she needed to do this for the good of the United States. So she became the first director and commanding officer of the WAC with the rank of colonel. She was the first woman to hold the rank of colonel in the United States military. She actually expanded the number of jobs that women could perform in the auxiliary corps from 54 to 239. And the corps expanded from a few thousand to 100,000. There's a story of a General White testifying before the Senate saying, oh, the women have really proved highly valuable, but they'll never be able to replace a man on a one-to-one basis. He said, at best, it'll take 3 women to replace two men. Within a short period of time, he was proved absolutely wrong. In fact, they found that 3 women could replace 4 men, and except in those jobs requiring real physical strength, they could replace 2 or more men in most jobs. Next slide. Here she is talking with some women. She was, besides the organizational part, she was out finding out what women needed. Next slide. And she actually did something quite unusual. Unfortunately, as most people know, the military was segregated at that time, and even the black units had to be commanded by white officers. She said, that's not going to happen in the WAC. She said, we're going to have black women commanding black soldiers. And she, in fact, did that. And here's a picture of her talking with some of the black women who served in the WAC. In 1943, the WACs actually received full Army status. Before that, they were an auxiliary corps. and she took the oath as director of the Women's Army Corps, becoming the first woman admitted into the new Army component. Next slide. In January 45, she was the first woman to receive the Army's Distinguished Service Medal. During her time as head of the WACs, she took it from 25,000 women performing 54 non-combatant service jobs to 100,000 qualified women who could serve in 406 of the 628 military occupations. She was truly a woman of great vision and understood the role she and the women of the WAC had played in shaping the course of not only women in the U.S. military, but after the war in the United States.
All right, thank you, General. Ms. Flood, could you speak to the contributions of Speaker Rayburn, please?
I can. We'll move to the next slide. While all the war was going on in Europe, Congress back home was writing legislation that affected what America could do. And Speaker Rayburn was instrumental in a lot of that legislation. He was appointed as Speaker in September of 1940, and probably his first true test as Speaker was the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the president to transfer American arms to friendly governments before the U.S. got involved in the war. It was a very tricky bit of legislation because America at that time was isolationist. They didn't want to get involved in the war in Europe. And the House really didn't want to pass this legislation. But Speaker Rayburn worked with them on getting some provisions in there that would allow them to approve this legislation, including that it would only last for 2 years, that we couldn't send convoys over there, and that the president would make frequent reports both to Congress and to the heads of the armed forces to make sure that America was not getting itself involved in the war. Unfortunately, Pearl Harbor changed things, and we did get involved in the war. After that, one of the big projects that Rayburn was involved in wasn't known at the time, and that was getting funding for the Manhattan Project. The Secretary of War, the Army Chief of Staff, and the project lead for the Manhattan Project came to him and explained to him how important it was to maintain secrecy of this project, that no one could know what was being researched and developed because they were afraid Germany would find out about this project. They actually believed that Germany was working on a similar project on their own and wanted to make sure that America beat them to it. So Rayburn managed to get $1.6 billion in appropriations bills passed. In his mind, it was to save 500,000 American soldiers' lives. That's what they had told him when they approached him about the project. In the end, 8 House members and 4 Senate members were the only ones to, and the president were the only ones to know about the Manhattan Project and its funding. Even the Vice President, Truman, didn't know about it until he became president and he was briefed. The last one that really affected after the war was the Marshall Plan. And it was developed on a policy not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos in Europe. And it was really easy to pass because Europe was devastated by this war. And the US wanted to make sure that you didn't have guerrillas coming in and taking over control of these countries that were still in turmoil. So it provided $13 billion in long-term loans to rebuild Western Europe. after the destruction of the World War II. Next slide. Of course, the president is the one who asks for war, but it's Congress who actually signs the declaration of war. So this is actually Roosevelt asking Congress to declare war, and Speaker Rayburn is behind him. Next slide. And this has to do with the Selective Service Act. There was a lot of protest about it. Next slide. But Rayburn actually signed up for the draft, even though his age, he was older than he was required to sign up. The draft lasted to 45, and he was beyond that, but he felt it was important. So.
All right. We have any audio difficulty, or is that the end of your, okay, there we go. Sounded like an audio problem. All right, we'll go back to the general now, and we are focusing on leaders. So General Hagee, please share Admiral Nimitz's leadership and how it was demonstrated in particularly difficult situations.
I can think of a couple. Probably the biggest one, I sort of set the stage when I talked about the pressure he was under when he took over the Pacific in December of 1941. The Japanese were on the move. We were able to stop them in April of 42 there in the Battle of Coral Sea and actually protected Australia. But the Battle of Midway was in fact developing. And there was contention between the intel section back in Washington, D.C. and the one in the Pacific. Back in D.C., they did not believe it was going to occur in Midway. And Admiral Nimitz, because of his intelligence officer, Rochefort, believed that in fact it would occur in Midway, and decided that that is where the battle was going to happen. If what we call the correlation of forces were actually against the United States. The Japanese fleet was larger. They had more battleships than we had. They had more aircraft carriers than we had. And they should have, strictly from a correlation of forces standpoint, they should have won. It was interesting what Nimitz told his commanders. He said, essentially, we cannot lose this battle. We cannot lose our ships. But if there is an opportunity for us to take out the Japanese fleet, go all in. It almost sounds contradictory, but in fact, he knew how important it was. And then what did he do after he had given that order? He went out behind his headquarters at Pearl Harbor and he tossed horseshoes. He did it for two reasons. And it shows unbelievable leadership. Number one, he had already talked with his commanders and he had faith in the commanders and they would execute it properly. Number two, and sometimes we forget this, the United States, the average citizen in the United States was really concerned about Japan and that they were going to win the war. He invited the reporters to come and watch him pitch horseshoes with the sailors to send the signal back home that we're in charge and it's going to be okay. Significant leadership on the battlefield and a strategic sense to communicate back to the American people. If we have time, I have a couple other stories that I could tell, but I'll stop there right now.
All All right, Mr. Akers, if you would share General Eisenhower's leadership and how it was demonstrated, particularly in difficult situations.
So his role was as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe in World War II, and the Allies had decided early on that they needed one person who can coordinate the invasion. They did not need a committee. They needed someone who ultimately could work with all the different decision makers and make that final decision. It was President Roosevelt that chose General Eisenhower for that role in 1943. And the biggest decision that General Eisenhower had to make was to launch that invasion. D-Day. Originally, it was scheduled for June 5th in 1944. The Allies, they set it up. They had a very narrow window, 2 days of having the right tides, having the troops on the ships, having everything ready to go, and then the weather changed, and they couldn't go on June 5th. Late in that day, Eisenhower got a weather report saying that there was a break in the weather coming, and they thought that there was going to be a very narrow window to be able to launch that invasion. He discussed it with his subordinates of all the other decision makers. They each gave them their opinions, but in the end, it was his decision, and he said, "We'll go. We're launching the invasion." He turned to subordinates who might have disagreed on some parts of that and asked them to document their objections, so if the invasion failed, that failure would not go on them. It would be on him. So the leadership quality of a boldness, making a decision, but also taking responsibility for his actions. And launching this invasion, and it worked out, but it was very difficult with all those changes with the weather, that he expected that it might not succeed. So he famously took out a notebook and wrote a note that today we call the "in case of failure" letter. And it was his preparation if the invasion failed, that he would take responsibility for it. And the letter talks about, we haven't gained a satisfactory foothold. I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all the bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. So making a decision, taking full responsibility for it. The only sign of stress we had from him was that letter, he dated it July 5th and not June 5th. He kept it in his wallet in case he needed it. And fortunately, he did not. He was aware of his great responsibility and that he was putting Allied and American soldiers in harm's way and that many were not going to come back. And he did not hide from that decision. One of the photos that I showed was of Eisenhower meeting with the paratroopers that launched on midnight before the invasion. Their job was to capture key transportation, crossroads and bridges to keep the German army from being able to respond to the invasion. And he went out, after he made that decision to launch the invasion, he went out and met with as many of the different units as he could. So that's a famous photograph where he's meeting with them, looking them in the eye. He knew what he was asking them to do, and he made this incredible personal connection with his troops. That photograph of him with the paratroopers is often talked about the order of the day, about success. But I mean, I've heard a story about him that he was talking about fly fishing, trying to put the troops at ease, trying to make this personal connection with him, and he certainly did that. So his qualities of decisiveness, of taking responsibility, of meeting with his troops and understanding his responsibility there, and also the leadership quality of really working with difficult personalities, presidents and prime ministers, field marshals, to keep them all together to succeed at the mission. So these are some of his qualities of leadership.
All right, General Hagee, if you would speak to Colonel Hobby's leadership as she demonstrated it.
Probably the bottom line on her, we would not have had the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps if it had not been for her. I believe that completely. Remember, what was first passed was that it was an auxiliary corps. And that meant that it was not officially a part of the Army. So when she went to the Army to get her doctors paid, as an example, they said, no, not our problem. They're not part of the Army. They're in the Auxiliary Corps. When she went to get barracks for these women, no, not our problem. They're in the Auxiliary Corps. They're not part of the United States Army. She solved every single one of these issues, got the money from Congress where she needed to. She went around the Army in order to get it done. She was focused on accomplishing her mission and taking care of the women that were recruited into the WAC. And most of that was not solved until the following year when the Congress finally made it a part of the newest component of the Army. She worked 7 days a week, 12 to 15 hours a day. John talked about all of the various field marshals and prime ministers and whatnot that Eisenhower had to deal with, and Nimitz had to deal with MacArthur and all the other individuals out there in the Pacific. She had exactly the same issues in Washington, dealing with senior individuals in the Army, dealing with senior individuals in the administration, and senior individuals on the Hill. And she accomplished it. She took that responsibility personally, and she took care of all of her women, including the Black women, as I talked about before. And I'll just end it where I started. Without her, and without her leadership ability, and without her dedication, we would have not had the Army, the Women's Army Corps.
Thank you, General. Ms. Flood, how about Speaker Rayburn's leadership in those difficult situations?
Probably the most difficult piece of legislation he managed to pass during World War II was an extension on the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. That originally, the draft was supposed to be for 12 months, and then they were promised they would be released. At first, Rayburn, Roosevelt, and others spoke against extending the draft. But as war in Europe continued, he began to rethink his position. As the war raged on, it seemed increasingly ill-advised to release the majority of the U.S. armed forces, and they started pushing for an 18-month extension. It passed through the Senate, but they had problems getting it through the House, and rightly so. They'd already promised these boys they could go home after 12 months. However, it just was not looking favorable for that. So this really was a chance for Rayburn to showcase his adept use of the House's parliamentary procedure and knowing the rules of the House. As the debate went on and on about whether or not to extend the Selective Service Act, he started talking to people. His best way of doing this was just to make a personal appeal. He would talk to people one-on-one, go to other House members and say, this is why we need to do this, and do I have your support? Can you help us help our boys? So when he never got a true feeling that he could get this passed. So he finally called for a vote, and he got a first and second roll call on that vote. He saw the tally and he was a little nervous about it. And he asked another House member, or another House member asked to be acknowledged, and called for recapitulation of the votes. And Speaker Rayburn was pretty savvy about that. He immediately allowed it, which froze the tally, and it allowed the vote to stand as it was, which was 203 for extending the draft and 202 against. So the Selective Service Act extension in 1941 passed by one vote less than 4 months before Pearl Harbor. So and it prevented the discharge of nearly 1 million men from the armed forces less than 4 months before that attack.
All right, thank you. Looks like we've had a number of questions pop into the Q&A, so I'll distribute those around to the various presenters. First, General Hagee, how do you explain Joe Rochefort's assignment after the Battle of Midway? Why wasn't Rochefort decorated for his extraordinary intelligence accomplishment that facilitated the success at Midway? And why did Nimitz tolerate Rochefort's treatment after Midway?
I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on that. I do not know. My sense is that we know how Nimitz protected Rochefort during the time up to Midway. I just don't have the answer afterwards, except that the war was going on. It was still not a foregone conclusion. Guadalcanal was coming up. The first landing. The Japanese army had never been defeated, just like the Japanese Navy had not been defeated before Midway, and the focus may have been on the war itself. But the real answer is I do not know. Sorry.
Oh, we have another question for you, General. Are the Nimitz family papers at the museum, and do they include the Admiral's grandfather's papers?
We have some of the papers here. We have most of the letters home that he wrote, both while he was at the Naval Academy. We have some of the letters that were written home to his wife, where he talks about, don't worry, I'm probably going to get fired out here pretty soon, and I'll be coming home. I don't know about his grandfather's papers. They may be. We focus more on Nimitz, some of the Nimitz family, and World War II. They may be held by the Texas Historical Commission. There's another large archive in Austin. I just don't know the answer to that one.
Okay. Ms. Flood, could you discuss the impact of the Lend-Lease Act in Texas, particularly the #1 British Flying Training School in Terrell? Was that a product of the Lend-Lease Act, as were other civilian air schools?
Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that. I know Lend-Lease really gave the president a whole lot of latitude on who we could send military aid to in the form of arms and weapons. I'm not sure that the #1 British Training School was a part of the Lend-Lease Act.
Okay. All right, I'm looking through some of our other questions here. Okay. Another question for you, Ms. Flood. How big of a help was Speaker Rayburn to Colonel Hobby's efforts, or was he not a help to her efforts?
That's a great question. I know that Hobby was a great friend of his sister's, so I am sure that he was very happy to help her in any way he could in getting that legislation passed and getting women the rights in the military that they rightly deserved. But we don't have any specific papers that say anything to that effect.
Okay. General Hagee, why was Colonel Hobby kept at the rank of colonel as opposed to possibly being made a brigadier or major general during her time? Was that structural, or was that in some ways discriminatory against her role as a woman?
Actually, neither one. In July of '45, she resigned from the Woman Army Corps for two reasons. One, her husband was ill in Houston, and she was literally exhausted She actually went over to the Army hospital there in Washington, D.C., because she was literally sick. And General Marshall had told her, don't let them find you unfit for duty, because that will set us back. And so in the Marine Corps, we say she sucked it up. She went in there and she was found fit for duty. She walked out of the hospital. She resigned, and her husband had a stretcher there to take her to a hospital to let her recuperate. So she resigned in July because of bad health of her husband and serious health problems that she had. Fortunately, she recovered fully, as we all know, and went back to Houston and continued to do great things there in Houston.
General, since we have you speaking now about Colonel Hobby, two questions. One, is there a favorite book on Colonel Hobby that you would recommend? And two, can you speak to her role in President Eisenhower's cabinet? Obviously, a connection between two of our leaders here. So,
yeah, she was obviously she was a cabinet member, and that name has changed. It was really Education and Human Services. It's been changed to something else. So after she recovered, Eisenhower asked her to serve there. And actually, he wanted her to stay, but like in most of the jobs she held in Washington, she wanted to go back to Houston. That's where she wanted to come home to Texas, and to her husband and to everything that she had going on there. There's actually, I'm looking for it right here. I don't have it. There's actually, I don't remember the name of it. Just a moment. Here is a very nice little book, and it focuses on one thing, not about her role in Houston and what she did before or after, but about her role during World War II and the Woman Army Corps. And it's called Oveta Cult Hobby, Colonel, Cabinet Member, Philanthropist.
all right, thank you, General. All right, let me look through the questions here. Mr. Akers, this is kind of what I might say down deep in the weeds, so we'll give this a try. Do you know if Eisenhower agreed that Agent Garbo, Juan Pujol, was a significant reason for Operation Overlord's success? Again, that's deep in the weeds of
Could you repeat that first part of the question, please?
Sure. Do you know if Eisenhower agreed that Agent Garbo, real name Juan Pujol, was a significant reason for Operation Overlord's success?
I know that there was a variety of different levels of both planning, but also working with the French resistance, a variety of different things that came into the ultimate success of that, but I can't speak specifically on that question.
All right. And let me take a look here through the questions. I think this is kind of a good one to kind of recap for each of you, and you may have already touched on it. But if you had to choose one accomplishment from each of these individuals, what would you consider their greatest accomplishment? Ms. Flood, we'll start with you. Speaker Rayburn's greatest accomplishment.
I think I'd have to go with the extension of the Selective Service Act. It kept our men in the Army and in the Navy in play and trained, ready to go when Pearl Harbor happened. We already had a trained military force that we could utilize. If they had let that fall, we wouldn't have had any men to protect ourselves with at that time.
All right, Mr. Akers, General Eisenhower's greatest accomplishment.
It was General Eisenhower's decision to launch the D-Day invasion on June 6th of 1944. And I said there was only a 2-day window to do that invasion with the tides. If they didn't go the next day, they would have to defer for 2 weeks out. And the weather turned out on those dates to be atrocious. So there would not have been an invasion if he had not made the decision on that evening to take advantage of that window and to launch that invasion.
General Hagee, Admiral Nimitz's greatest accomplishment.
Oh, I think without a doubt, it's what he did there in Pearl Harbor after the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese on the 7th of December. The fleet was in ruins. The morale was at the bottom. When he came in, the staff there were convinced they were all going to be fired and all replaced. And he came in and got them all together and quietly said, "You're my guys." They were all guys at that time. "You're my guys, and we're going to win this." And think of the personal pressure he was under when the Navy did not even consider him one of the top 40 admirals in the Navy. And yet for the next 6 months until after Midway, no one knew that except for him, and he handled that. And he handled General MacArthur. So his handling of those first 6 months after Pearl Harbor was, to me, his greatest accomplishment. If I could take one liberty and tell one short story, I think that also shows the other side of the man. This goes to the 2nd of September, 1945. Admiral Halsey had put out a message to all ships: when the Japanese come on board the USS Missouri, you will, if they have any swords or sidearms, you will take them, and you will not serve them anything to eat or drink. Nimitz saw that and immediately countermanded it and said, "The war is over. When the Japanese come on board the USS Missouri, you will treat them as you would any other representative of any other nation." That shows two sides of the man. I would argue that, I don't know about Sam Rayburn, but I would argue that General Marshall had those same identical characteristics.
And Colonel Hobby's greatest accomplishment, sir?
Well, without a doubt, standing up the Women's Army Corps, as I've already said. I truly do not believe that it would have been accomplished without her. She was a very special woman. I would have liked to have met her. Her grandson has told me, well, maybe not. She was pretty tough, but without a doubt, is standing up and what we're talking about is standing up of the Women Army Corps.
All right. Well, we're running close on time. I'd like to ask each of our participants to kind of finish up with the final question here. And that is, what else can someone learn by visiting your museum or historic site? Mr. Akers, why don't we start with you?
So my site is one of the sites is the Eisenhower Birthplace in Denison, Texas. And this is the small house in a working class neighborhood that Dwight Eisenhower was born in 1890. And although he lived there for a short time, it's during World War II that the house comes to the attention of its community. When he gets appointed to Europe in 1942, there are people, neighbors, people that remember the family, people that remember him. One woman who even remembered holding him as a baby. And during this time, they started an effort to purchase the house to make it what they called a shrine to General Eisenhower, but to all the people, all the men serving in the American military. And remember, this is a time of rationing at home, a time of sacrifice, when many people serving in the military, and Denison, like many places, had some of their young men that went off who did not come back. And so they preserved this house, invited him in April of 1943. So it's really it's a wartime story. It's a home front story. It's also a story about what General Eisenhower meant to the people, average people, the people on the home front.
And Ms. Flood, what can folks learn from visiting the Rayburn House?
Well, Sam Rayburn had two sides. He was a master statesman, but he was also a rural farmer. So we tell his farm life story more than we talk about his political career, though their two are intertwined. So when you come to the Sam Rayburn House State Historic Site, you'll get to see how he lived at home and what he did for this community and for Texas in general as the representative for the 4th Congressional District. And also, we have his Cadillac. We have several other of his historic cars. The Cadillac was given to him when he lost the speakership, when the Democrats lost control of the House. All of his fellow House members pitched in $25 and bought him the Cadillac that he had lost because he no longer was Speaker and no longer had the car. So it really shows that there was a bipartisan support for Speaker Rayburn, and we love telling that story. We love talking about his farm life as well.
All right. And General Hagee, what can folks learn from visiting the National Museum of the Pacific War?
Well, several things. Our main gallery, the Bush Gallery, focuses on and you see actually that's the Nimitz Gallery there, but the Bush Gallery focuses on World War II in the Pacific. It actually goes back before Pearl Harbor to try to set the scene, and then goes all the way through the dropping of the 2 atomic weapons. We actually have the shell casing of the 3rd weapon that would have been dropped if the Japanese hadn't surrendered after Nagasaki. We also have another gallery. It's called the Nimitz Gallery, which details Nimitz's life not only during World War II, but his life here in Fredericksburg and throughout his career. We also have another gallery down at the Pacific Combat Zone where we have a TBM Avenger, the type of aircraft that President Bush flew and actually was shot down in the war in the Pacific, and actually have a PT boat, the only PT boat actually on display, to my knowledge, that was actually used in World War II.
All right, thank you, General. And I want to thank everyone for attending our webinar today. Be sure to be on the lookout for future webinars from the Texas Historical Commission on a variety of topics. And once again, thank you for your time today.